Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jack Lazarchak, and I'm a developer at Chariot Solutions. If you're anything like me, you've got about a dozen personal projects and things you've been meaning to learn that you've put on the back burner because you found something else to move on to for the day. It's hard to keep up with all the different languages, frameworks, tools, but when companies such as GitHub, Atlassian, and Facebook are adopting GraphQL, it's obvious that it's gaining popularity and probably worth a bit of your time to understand. Though I've done cursory research on GraphQL, I've never given it the deep dive it truly deserves. Our next presenter is going to shed some light on a scenario where GraphQL had far outshined what was possible with REST and hopefully convince me to drop whatever I'm currently working on to go learn more about GraphQL. Here to tell us more about that is VP of Patient Engagement at TrialScope, Mike Wenger. Before I hand it over, I just want to take a moment to give a big thanks to Mike, everybody watching, all the sponsors. You know, it's definitely a bummer that we couldn't meet in person this year, but I'm really glad that we were able to do this. And I know I certainly have enjoyed this conference, even though, you know, we couldn't meet in person. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to you, Mike, and over to you now.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Jack. I hope this talk makes you a convert and gets you drinking the same Kool-Aid that I've been drinking. I definitely was slow to adopt GraphQL. I thought it was kind of interesting, but as you mentioned, a lot of other things on your plate to learn. In my mind, it just seems like an alternative to REST, not a massive step forward as a technology. And so I had it on the back burner for a while. And then it wasn't until I ran into a very specific business case where I needed to pull it in. And then I made the investment, learned it, and I don't know if I could go back to REST at this point. I think there's a lot of promising aspects of GraphQL, and I'm excited on this talk today to share that story with you all about the business case that I ran into, how we solved it with GraphQL, and share that. So before diving into the presentation, as Jack mentioned, so I'm a software developer. I've primarily worked in health tech across my career. So I first kind of started at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's research. Worked at a healthcare company, Epion Health, where we had a solution with iPads in the doctor's office and checking in patients digitally. I was a consultant at the agency ThoughtBot and had a great experience there, going and getting to work with a lot of different companies in the New York City area and working with a lot of different teams. And GraphQL was actually being adopted by a lot of our clients at that time. So that was my first sneak peek to what was going on. And now today I work at TrialScope as the Vice President of Patient Engagement. And so in terms of the story, there's definitely a technical component to this talk. But in order, I think, to understand the technical, you have to just understand the business space that we were making decisions in and trying to understand the problem that we had in front of us. So I am going to take just a few minutes to walk you all through what that business problem was. I promise it'll be quick. We'll get to the technical fun stuff. I do promise we'll get to the good stuff. But just walking through what the business problem we had. Want to just, for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with the world of clinical trials, and for anyone that's not familiar, a clinical trial is a opportunity where there's promising new science for a new drug or cure. But before that can become available on the drug shelf or be prescribed by doctors, it has to run through a very rigorous set of testing where you have true documentation around the efficacy of that drug and the safety of that drug in patient populations. And so before any drug gets approved by the FDA, it goes through a clinical trial process of phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials. Definitely a really interesting industry. It's the industry that I've been in for almost the past 10 years. But you don't have to learn too much about it on this call, but really just understand there's an idea of a patient that has a specific disease, and that patient is eligible or ineligible to participate in certain trials that they might be interested in. And so all clinical trials are publicly listed. There in the US, there's a registry called clinicaltrials.gov, where you could go and see all the trials that are running here in the United States. For Europe, there's UDRA-CT, and there's other registries around the world, depending on what country you live in. So the data's out there, the trials exist. A very common use case as a patient is you will go and you will say, I have a specific condition. It could be Crohn's disease, a type of cancer. It could be heart disease. And you're basically saying, given my age and gender and location, what trials near me are a good fit? And it's very similar, as you could imagine, to any sort of search experience, whether you're on Airbnb or Kayak, you're looking to go from all of the trials that are being run today to what are the ones that are most relevant to me. The problem is the filter capabilities are pretty limited. It's not the same sort of Kayak experience where you can say, I want flights from United that take off before 11 a.m. and are direct flights. The only structured filter capabilities that exist are age, gender, location. So as a patient, and this is applicable to me, I have a benign brain tumor and have a very fortunate prognosis, but I am in the New York City area. I do have a brain tumor. And so when I put in my information into the search, I match to 102 actively recruiting trials. That doesn't mean I actually would qualify for 102 trials. It just means the best the search can recommend to me is I match to 102 trials. And when then the onus is on me to review each of those 102 and read individual trial pages that look a lot like this, where there is information that can help me figure out if I would be qualified for this trial or if I am not eligible for this trial. I have to do that 102 times. And so it definitely is a very poor experience. It's an experience that as an organization, we were looking to improve upon this baseline. And one of the challenges is that the eligibility criteria is unstructured text that has no conventions or standards. So you might have 50 or 60 different companies describing the same concept in different terms. So you can try to improve that through natural language processing or manual review. And what we ended up developing at our company was a admin system that allowed experts to go in and augment that trial data against a set of predefined filters. So you can see here's an example. We have eligibility criteria for a specific trial on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, we have a set of filters that an expert that is trained is going in and essentially pulling out key data points to create a better filter experience. And then finally, what the output of that looks like is now something that we can hand over to patients or patient navigators so that when they go in and put in that same information to say we have a brain tumor patient, it's not just any brain tumor patient, it's a patient that has a glioblastoma that is non-high grade, and maybe a few other information data points around genetics or other things like that. And now we're narrowing down to, from that 102 matches down to ideally a few matches that are of a much higher quality match. So that was our solution. That was our product. And that's the business or the industry and business space that we were operating in. So to kind of switch gears to the technical side of things and how we approach this, our initial requirements were pretty simple. We had a white labeled trial matching solution that was powered by our company. And we also knew that filters may change over time. As new trials come online, there's always new information or new reasons why someone might be eligible or ineligible. And so it was important for us to, it wasn't a static list of filters. It very much was something that was going to be backed by a content management system where someone could add a new filter, add new options to an existing filter. So it was going to dynamically evolve over time for each therapeutic area. You'd have some filters specific to brain tumor, and then we would have some filters specific to breast cancer, and we would have some filters specific to Crohn's disease. So you can imagine, depending on the patient, the types of filters, the fact that those filters are changing over time, how you might go about implementing that as a web application that you manage 100% yourself. Maybe that there's a path forward for you. But one of the requirements that did come up for us was we had some partners where they weren't using our white labeled solution. They had existing mobile apps or solutions on iPads in doctors' offices, and they couldn't use our white labeled web application solution. They want it to replicate the same functionality via an API. And so that seemed pretty daunting, but we started thinking through what that might look like. We did a couple of technical spikes around how would we do this with REST. And one of the things that kind of came up in early conversations was, well, how would we handle versioning? So if a filter gets added in the future or a filter gets deprecated, all of a sudden, is that a new version bump? Is there a way for us to do that within REST? So that was a topic of conversation. If we were going to go down and have lots of different versions, now all of a sudden we have clients on different versions. Does that slow us down from a development standpoint, where we have to support folks that haven't migrated to new versions yet? Another consideration we had was there's a couple of models in the mix. There's the concept of a trial, and there's data points on a given trial. And then a trial has many site locations. So there's an association there. And then site locations have several data points. And so when our partners were going to build their UI, some of them only needed a few key trial data points. Some of them needed lots of site data points. And so we were concerned about payload size. And are we going to send over all the information? Are we going to send over smaller chunks of information? We were concerned about query performance. And then the other thing we were concerned about was if this was really difficult for us to maintain and keep bringing on new filters, and there was also going to be a development cost on the client side, that would maybe be a barrier to entry for a lot of organizations that didn't have large development teams and weren't interested in treating this as an ongoing investment. They were looking for a one-time setup, one-time integration. And so the idea of constantly bumping versions and adding new filters and having to update our documentation around those filters, and then a developer at a different company having to go and read that update and make the changes on their end, it all sounded very like a lot of friction, and it might prevent us from being successful in terms of getting partners to adopt and use our API. So we kind of did that spike. We went back to the drawing board a little bit. I had a little bit of experience with GraphQL, and we started spiking on what that might look like. And so these are the obligatory GraphQL overview slides. I grabbed a couple of screenshots just straight from their homepage. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I think their API documentation is incredible. It's very intuitive. It's very easy to go through and kind of quickly go from what is this to novice to expert. So definitely encourage anyone that's interested in this talk to go out and check out the GraphQL docs. I think for anyone that's brand new to GraphQL, the main thing that is important to know for the rest of the presentation is that GraphQL is an API query language that allows you as a client to specify what data you want to get back. And it uses a type system to make sure that there's a contract between the server and the client, where you can know in your code base in real time as you're typing out something for your mobile app, you would know if a type exists or not, if it's coming back as the correct, whether it's a string or an integer or an array of characters, whatever it may be. There is and if anyone's worked with TypeScript or any sort of type checking type system, it's very powerful once you start working in that world, because you get that real-time feedback to know if you're doing something that's breaking the contract or not. So this is a really important part of what makes GraphQL special. The last thing is that GraphQL really doesn't have a concept of versions. Every field can be deprecated at any point in time. There's tooling around knowing if a given field is being used in production. So you can send warnings and let people know in advance when a field is going to be deprecated. And you can easily add new types or new fields without breaking existing clients. So having worked in code bases where there was both a mobile API and a web API, and there was 4 versions of the web API and 3 versions of the mobile API, that overhead becomes really difficult to know, well, when can we stop supporting V1 of the mobile API? We launched that 5 years ago. Is anyone still using it? The fact that GraphQL doesn't have that overhead, there's no concept of versioning, was something that really struck us as, wow, this if implemented well and works with our partners, could be really beneficial and would make our lives a lot easier from a management and maintenance standpoint. I think that's, so when we kind of started thinking about GraphQL, right away, two things jumped out at us as highly valuable given our use case. So we have third-party clients, not managed by us, that are going to need data to query our clinical trial database and filter that trial database. So the fact that they can request just the data they need felt right and felt optimal, because now if a mobile app is displaying 4 data points, the payload size can be kept small and compact, and we can return just those 4 data points. If a client needs to put together an experience where they're displaying a trial and a site and more information about that site, we can make sure, again, that they're getting just the data that's needed for the clients to put the UI together. The other thing that we thought was really interesting, because we were talking about mobile clients, was optimizing around how many queries needed to be run. One of the things that I've seen a lot with REST APIs, and I think one of the big reasons why Facebook developed GraphQL was for their mobile client, in recognizing that on mobile or with low latency, when you're on a slow network, if you need to call 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 different API calls to get the data you need to put together a UI, that is going to be a slow loading UI. And so the fact that GraphQL allows for all of that different data across different models to come back in a single query, that is very powerful from a performance standpoint, particularly on mobile, particularly on low latency mobile. So this is all the stuff. If you've ever seen another GraphQL talk, this is going to be the main selling points that maybe other people have highlighted. It definitely was a great sell for us. The thing that was a little bit unique about our business case that I mentioned at the top of the call is that we wanted to build a solution where our partners could dynamically build filters without ongoing development or additional support needed on their end. And our hypothesis was that they could use our schema, and the schema is something that comes with GraphQL, where it basically lays out all of the various types, how they're related to each other. Is this field going to be returned as a string or an integer? And so our hypothesis was that we could allow our clients to basically set up and say, we're a mobile app for ovarian cancer patients. There are only 4 advanced match filters available today for ovarian cancer patients, and it's these 4 questions. But in the future, if the organization maintaining that matching engine were to add a 5th filter or a 6th filter, or add more fields to existing filters, we want our mobile app to dynamically update to that additional information without any development cost on our end. So that's what we were trying to go out and solve for. And I'll show you what that looks like in a demo. So I'm going to switch over to my browser. So one of the things that we did is, obviously, with any API being consumed by third-party clients, we definitely put an investment into our API documentation. So I think I mentioned at the top of the call, so I currently work at TrialScope. If anyone was interested in taking this for a test drive, you can go to docs.clinicaltrialconnect.com. Clinical Trial Connect was my company that I had been running for a few years, and TrialScope acquired us last year. So whether you see Clinical Trial Connect in some of the documentation here, just know that Clinical Trial Connect is now part of the TrialScope family, and we're continuing to build on this platform. So I think the key thing that we obviously had to spell out to folks was GraphQL. There was a little bit of educating around why are we using GraphQL, what are the benefits. There was a little bit of friction there, I'll be honest. but we made it really important to invest in open source documentation, any additional libraries or SDKs that might make it easier for developers to get started with. I think Jack mentioned GitHub. GitHub has some amazing API documentation around their GraphQL API. And so we definitely looked at some best-in-class documentation examples and tried to do our best to help people get started quickly. And so our queries and mutations are the two ways you interact with the GraphQL API. There's not really the same concept of CRUD of like a post request or a patch request or a GET request or anything like that. All API calls are a post call to the same endpoint, whatever your domain is /GraphQL. And so that took a little bit of educating around and just was a bit different from how you might think about REST. And then you are either running a query and getting data back, or you're running a mutation, which is either creating a record or updating a record or deleting a record. So we broke it down from there. We have kind of examples on the right-hand side. This API documentation is all built out using Postman. So for anyone that uses the Postman service, definitely highly recommend their suite of tools. They make it really easy both for testing your API and then also generating public documentation for it. But we kind of broke down different types of query types, whether it's a basic match or advanced match. And I'll walk you through a couple of those examples. So what we're looking at here is in the browser, a GraphQL client called GraphQL. And this is actually a GitHub open source project that you can easily add to your project if you get involved and start doing more GraphQL. And what it is on the left-hand side is the query that you're going to run. And then on the right-hand side will be the response. And what's really nice is they provide a nice docs tab where we could go over and actually inspect the current schema for this GraphQL API. And we can search all the various types. We can see the relationships between those types. And so I think if you do go down the path and especially Jack, if you start drinking the Kool-Aid and you get set up using the GraphQL gem, if you're in Ruby and Ruby on Rails world or however you can incorporate that into your project, very powerful, makes it really easy as a developer to quickly get your bearings and understand how an API works. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we have queries. So we have different types of top-level queries. We have a concept of advanced matching, which is really trying to take what existed in clinicaltrials.gov and layering on additional match capabilities. We have a concept of base match, which really is the standard matching you would get if you were to just use clinicaltrials.gov directly. We have the ability to filter by a specific trial. So very similar in REST, if you were to just say /trials /ID. We have a similar concept here where you can query a specific trial. We have the ability to query for all trials. So same sort of data you would be getting out of a REST API. It conceptually is a little bit different how it's implemented under the hood. But what's really neat is you can see what is possible directly using the schema. And you can dive in at any point in time and click. So I could click into base matches and we can get a nice explanation as to what each of these fields are. So a condition is, you can query by one or more conditions. And I know that I can basically pass an array of conditions. There's a concept also in clinical trials called mesh terms. So that's another option for filtering. And so right away, what's kind of neat is I could go over, we also have a concept of base filters here. So we could filter it by anything like age, gender, how far is the patient willing to travel, their zip code. Maybe if they don't provide their zip code, we could get the geographic coordinates of latitude and longitude. So all of this is self-documenting from our GraphQL schema. And now if we wanted to interact with this query, and this is a very simple query, we're looking for all brain tumor trials in the zip code of the New York City area of 10018. And specifically, I want to get the count of how many trials exist, and I want to get the title of each of those trials. So we'll run our search, and we can see that currently there are 11 trials in this sandbox environment that are tagged brain tumor that are near that zip code of 10018. And again, as a client, as a mobile client, let's say, I only want it to get the title because I'm just displaying a nice index list of trial titles. But maybe we get new requirements from the design team and we say, oh, well, the title is helpful, but we also need to include additional information. We want to include things like the official status of that trial. And what's really nice is because of our type checking schema in place, I have a nice autocomplete option where I can see all of the available types that exist on a trial record. Anything from the ID to the title, to the status, contact information, phase of trial. And so maybe we decide that we want to include not just the title, the overall status, but also the phase, whether it's a phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trial, because a patient might only be interested in a phase 3. So now when we run our search, the data that comes back to the mobile client would now include not just the title of that trial, but the overall status of is it actively recruiting or not? And then is it a phase 1, a phase 2, or a phase 3? So the server sets up all of these types once, but every client can now customize the data that they need and put a query in place to get just the data that they need. From an association standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, a trial has many sites. So if we wanted to dive in and see some of those sites, what's really nice is I can now autocomplete to see all of the fields on a site. So a site might have a facility name of the medical institution where this trial is being run. And it'll have things like the city of what city in the world is it being run at. So if we, again, got a new requirement for our mobile app, we needed to update our UI, a very simple query update allows us to now make sure we can get that data directly from the server. And if there is a trial that has multiple sites, which we can see a couple of examples of, here we have a trial that has sites in Hartford, Basking Ridge, Middleton, Montvale. I'll maybe just add state real quick to make sure that we can put the full UI together. And now we have a nice example of that's Montvale, New Jersey, Middleton, New Jersey, Basking Ridge, New Jersey, Hartford, Connecticut. So definitely the ability to add fields as you go, as you need them is very powerful. What's really nice is if you do use some more kind of additional GraphQL tooling, whether that's Apollo or Relay, or there's a lot of other tools out there that help you further leverage GraphQL. You could have something where in your text editor, whether you're a Vim user or VS Code or Sublime or wherever you are, it would automatically know as you're building out this UI to populate or say, this isn't a valid field in the schema. There's a lot of great integrations if anyone is a fan of React. Facebook did a great job of having a lot of the React benefits tie in nicely with GraphQL, and there's a lot of different solutions there through Relay or in Apollo that make a nice handoff between those two technologies. But yeah, I think this is kind of a nice way to understand the fields. And then from a filter standpoint, what's really nice is we can add more filters as we go. So today it's zip code, but if we also wanted to specify the user's age, for instance, we could put in something maybe where we're just kind of trying to say, oh, well, I have someone that's 45. And if we did a query, what's really nice is we get feedback to know that this query was not valid. And it was actually in the schema letting us know that it can't be a string, it needs to be an integer. And so now we're able to see right away, this needs to be an integer, so therefore 45. And now we're querying against just patients of that age. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So you could see over time, your query gets a little bit bigger and bigger. There's more filters. There's more fields that you are looking to incorporate into your mobile UI. And then eventually what we got to a point of was we started introducing filters that were on, in addition to those clinicaltrials.gov filters. So things like the stage of cancer you have, there's a couple different values there of 1, 2, 3, 4 that a patient would be able to know and answer. We also had filters around, have you started immunotherapy or not? And so what's really neat is you can hover over any sort of question. It can give you the definition and what the different type options are. So we can see for newly diagnosed cancer, we can always refer to our docs over here as well. And so I could type in something like disease setting. And we could see all of the disease setting values and what those map to. So we can make sure that we're correctly using the right ones. And lastly, where it got really interesting was how do we help them in that mobile UI dynamically build the filters that they could then use to query back against our API. And one of the things that GraphQL offers is you can get all of the values for a given type. And so we had a type called colon cancer filters, which was basically showing all of the colon cancer specific filters. And so when we query for that, the mobile client was able to figure out what are the different questions or filter questions, what is the description for that question that we should display to the patient, and then what are the possible values that a patient would be able to answer yes, no, or unsure, and then use those values to then make an additional GraphQL query back against our child database. So we were able to actually implement that idea of a scalable set of filters. No development was needed on behalf of the third-party clients. And we're able to create an experience. Now we're using an API, users can go in, and it doesn't have to just be our web-hosted solution. A user can go in and do a high likelihood match for a new glioblastoma trial. And when they run their search, we're able to give them a high quality match based on that additional information, a much better quality match than they would have been able to get from that original data that existed in clinicaltrials.gov. So to bring it back to PowerPoint, that was all I was hoping to demo. I think one of the challenges that I outlined with our approach was we were dependent on other companies and other organizations using our API. And so there was a bit of education around GraphQL. Why are we doing this? There's a lot of initial feedback of, well, can you just create a REST endpoint? And we definitely had to walk them through why this wouldn't necessarily be possible with REST, or why it would be more challenging or not as performant as we would have liked. And then we really focused on trying to lower the barrier to entry, adding open source libraries and other documentation to help them get started, whether they were working in Node or .NET or Ruby on Rails. We really wanted to make sure that we were language agnostic when folks wanted to try to integrate and consume our API. So it definitely was an investment on our end, but I think we kind of came to the conclusion that we would not have been able to achieve what we did if we went down the path of using REST. So that's the end of my presentation. Jack would love to take questions from the audience if anyone has any.
Yeah, let me go over to the channel now and say if anybody has questions, start typing them and I will ask them. Thank you very much. That was super informative. So
Thanks.
actually a question I have, and this was always kind of my thing. I felt like anytime I looked up GraphQL, it was, obviously it's about querying. So you create data through that, like you can create data with GraphQL.
Yeah, I would describe GraphQL as like server side agnostic. So there's no, like whether you use Ruby on Rails or use another like that, there's no limitations or dependencies there. The GraphQL, that's the right way to describe this. Anything you can do with REST, whether it's creating, reading, updating, or deleting, you can do with GraphQL.
Okay.
It just, the terminology is a little bit different. You're going to be using more terms like query or mutation. You won't be using the same kind of concepts of CRUD, for instance. You also won't have the same URL structure you might expect, where backslash trials, backslash number one, backslash sites, backslash number five, that all goes away. And you now just have a single endpoint.
Right.
So sometimes in the early days with the developers, we were kind of using REST concepts while operating in a GraphQL world, and it led to some confusion. And so it was important for us to make sure everybody was speaking the same language.
Right.
We tried to drop some REST specific concepts from our verbiage. But you can still all do all the same things with REST. You
Right.
don't use any of that capability. It's just a little bit different how it's implemented.
Cool, thank you. So we have two questions. So first one from, and I'm gonna apologize in advance if I mess up anybody's name. Brian Howman asked, how does security work on this? Say you only want a certain group to be able to query a slice of a table. Is that possible, or do you need to handle that with sharding?
Great question, Brian. So I think what I like a lot about GraphQL is it does one thing really well, but it doesn't prescribe additional solutions. So as you go through the API docs, when it comes to things like authentication and authorization, it doesn't say this is how you have to do it. It provides guidance or links off to other resources. So for our application, it is a Ruby on Rails application. We do have a token based system where each partner of ours is getting a token. And so those clients, when we make the query, and we use a gem in Ruby on Rails that also is maintained by GitHub. And in the documentation there, it has some pretty good helpful starting points around how you might handle authorization and authentication. And what was really helpful for us is we do have kind of the concept of a private API or private fields. So there are some things that everybody can see that no matter what type of token you have. And then there are some things that are specific to only select organizations that have the right approval to access them. And so the schema kind of expands or collapses depending on what type of user you are.
Cool, thank you. Carl Roque asks, can you comment on any tools or techniques on the back end converting the GQL query to data retrieval?
Really good question. One of the big challenges we had was we had a lot of our filters stored in a Postgres JSON-B field. And so we were kind of pulling information out of that, turning that into types dynamically. And so there was definitely a whole project to understand the right way to implement that. Specifically, the Ruby GraphQL project makes it really easy to receive a query in GraphQL land and then convert that to an active record query in the database. I actually didn't have any code examples to pull up, but I can share after for anyone that's interested. I'll share a couple of slides that maybe would be helpful of what that looks like in Ruby specifically. But that Ruby GraphQL project does a great job of giving clear examples of when a type comes in and maybe you're querying for a specific trial ID, and if that trial ID doesn't exist, what sort of error response is appropriate. And strangely enough, you don't necessarily send like a 404. You might still be sending a 200 response, but you're going to have certain errors. There's a convention around how you would handle errors in that instance. But if a query comes in for an ID that does exist, it has a really nice handoff between the GraphQL parameter to a variable that you can then interact with and just plug in directly into an active record query to say, look up the trial with ID number 5.
Awesome. I actually think that's going to go quite well into this next question here. Greg Aiello asks, first, great presentation. And he says, how do you handle API errors on the client side? And did you use HTTP status codes at all?
Yeah. The error codes was an interesting one. I think similar, there wasn't a clear prescription of this is how it needs to be done. So we looked at a couple of other precedents out there and modeled our error handling off of that. It's been a bit since I've looked at it. So if I recall correctly, I believe we're sending 200 on all of our errors but we send an error type back that has, it has like an error field, which then says the type of error, and then a messages field, which would include any additional things like a validation error or something like that. But if I do recall correctly, I believe we're sending 200s for all of those errors.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's all sorts of applause in the Slack channel. Great presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sold.
The crowd goes wild.
I'll be looking to do it. Yeah, I know. We've been saying we need some sort of, you know, like a soundtrack button where we press it and makes all the applause sounds. So, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. Like I said, I don't believe you're on the Slack channel yet. If you do want to get on, feel free to. But you know, don't feel bad if you don't. So.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely look to join the Slack. And if anyone wants to reach out with follow-up questions, I put both my email and Twitter handle up there. Would love to continue the conversation offline. And big kudos to you, Jack, and team for continuing to move forward with this event and putting on a virtual event. I think amazing to pull this together and make that audible.